in the Life and Family Initiative at the Public Policy Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome everybody. Just a quick run of show here. We're going to start with a conversation with Joseph Zeballos-Roig. He's a congressional reporter who knows this stuff inside and out, and we'll talk for the first part of the hour with him, giving us the lay of the land on who's to watch, who's what the different options on the table are, and then after that conversation, we will move into our panel with three different voices of folks on the right who are engaging on this stuff. So, with that, let's bring in Joseph Zeballos-Roig. He's a former congressional reporter for Semaphore, Business Insider. He spent many long hours chasing Joe Manchin in the halls of Capitol Hill, trying to figure out his thinking on Build Back Better when that was all going down. And he's been as engaged as anybody in trying to understand congressional politics and tax policy. Joseph, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate everybody who's tuning in to learn about, this enormous tax battle that's going to be underway. I think a lot of people thought it'd be under divided government, but now Republicans are going to be in the driver's seat. So I think it's going to be really interesting and really telling to see how they sequence these tax cuts. Just as like a bit of a reminder, Republicans, did this big tax overhaul in 2017 under Trump. They set a lot of these tax provisions to expire because they thought that a future Congress would not be able to allow it to go back up. And that's exactly the environment that we're in. I think that Republicans are going to be in for an enormous fight within their own party on what provisions to prioritize, just because the price tag is so big and so many options are on the table. I think a lot of Republicans right now are prioritizing, and we'll tell you in the hallways of Congress, aides will tell you this too, that, they're looking for an extension of the tax cuts, but nobody really knows what that means yet. And I've had some recent conversations with GOP senators on this just yesterday. I think it's still pretty early days. They've had plenty of discussions about, what lowering the corporate tax rate will look like, or, a boost to the child tax credit, but nothing is really set in stone yet. So I think lots of these conversations still kind of early, and they're going to be waiting till next year when Trump is in office, President-elect Trump, to kind of dictate a lot of where the party goes on tax reform.
Right. Well, I think for the most of us who are on this call who are engaged in the space, the one that we're all keeping an eye on is that child tax credit. Uh, Currently $2,000 per kid. If Congress doesn't do anything, it would revert back to $1,000 after 2025. But given that I don't think it's in anybody's political interest on the Hill to sign a suicide note and that sort,
Mhm.
raising taxes on millions of parents across the land, I think that's probably unlikely. But to your point, there's a difference between extending the Trump tax cuts, locking in that $2,000 per child, and going bigger. Right? We saw during the campaign. Now, Vice President-elect Vance talk about much bigger numbers. I think that's probably out of the realm of possibility. But can you share a little bit of the chatter that you're hearing on the right, and maybe some of the bipartisan chatter too around what expanding the child tax credit might look like. You maybe also remind folks how those debates kind of faltered last year with the Wyden Smith deal, and where things stand right now.
hmm So I do believe that the child tax credit will give us a pretty good sense of where the GOP's priorities are, particularly on tax policy, because this is an area that traditionally would be, bipartisan. Democrats and Republicans have worked together on the child tax credit in the past, but as many here know, Democrats tried to do it on party line basis during the Build Back Better era. That fell apart because of resistance from Manchin. And a lot of Democrats, for example, would still be interested in doing something on child tax credit. But I think we'll have to see like where Republicans take it. And as you said, I think a lot of people were Vance's comments during the campaign, of a big plus up to the child tax credit and making it apply to nearly most all American families. I think that caught a lot of people's attention, just not merely because of the universality of it, but because of the huge price tag attached to it. So, I think that depending on the configuration of staff at the White House, Treasury, we could see something happen on the child tax rate, but not at that scale. For example, I think a common idea among Republicans, like I think pretty sure Chuck Grassley, a very influential Republican on tax issues, has had a bill for many years to just index the child tax credit to inflation. I think that would be something that would be that would get a lot of Republicans' interests. And depending on Vance's own sway on Capitol Hill, if he starts advocating for like a larger baby bonus, that's something that we'd have to keep an eye on. But Patrick, you and I have talked about this as well. Vance's traditional allies who might be interested in this, on the child tax credit, Marco Rubio seems to be headed towards State Department. Hawley is still in there, but I think there's going to be a lot of eyes on where Republicans go on the child tax credit for sure.
Yeah, Senator Rubio leaving the Hill sounds like Senator Romney, obviously getting ready to retire. Senator Vance getting the promotion, but obviously leaves some empty chairs at the table on the Senate side when it comes to this sort of new, more pro-family, more maybe more populist strain on the right. I think there's going to be opportunities for senators who want to step up and lead that charge, and remains to be seen who might want to fill those shoes. I'm curious, as do your reporting and analysis on this stuff, who are some of the key Republicans on the Senate side? And then we'll go to the House in a second. But specifically, I mean, I think we all, a lot of folks know that Senator Crapo from Idaho is a key figure when it comes to these tax fights. He was very influential in getting Republicans to vote down the CTC modest expansion that was proposed last Congress. So he's obviously somebody who will continue to play a huge role. You mentioned Grassley. Who else do you think is, somebody who's worth watching, who has a lot of sway in the conference during this time when leadership is changing and administration is changing, all that kind of stuff?
I think Hawley will retain a decent amount of influence on family policy. He's a very close Trump ally. I think he and Vance are on the same populist wavelength when it comes to economic policy for families. So I think these are going to be a couple key figures to watch in the Senate. And then, going a little bit to the House too, I think the Ways and Means Chair Jason Smith is going to be another key figure to look at just because of his past work on the child tax credit. As you mentioned, there was that, Wyden Smith tax bill that, came out of the House and with a blowout bipartisan vote, but it stalled in the Senate because Republicans eventually made a bet that, they would win the Senate and they could just cut a better deal next year. That bet definitely has paid off for them. But yeah, we'll have to see, for example, like some of the work that remains to be done on the child tax credit, because something I'll be like keeping an eye on too is the relationship between Jason Smith and Crapo. We'll have to see if some of like the negotiations that faltered on the tax bill, Crapo didn't support Smith in the end. See if that affects like the trajectory for pro-family policy as well in this tax fight.
Yeah, can you share a little bit more about that for people who weren't following that, super closely? Uh, yeah, as you mentioned, House passes this bill that Smith was very heavily involved in, and then I guess it led to some real tensions within the GOP caucus. And do you think those are still going to be present, or do you think victory is kind of heals all wounds, and that's going to be water under the bridge?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it's a little early to see like how Crapo and Smith handle these things. I feel like with Trump in the driver's seat, Republicans are treating their new majorities as if they have like a huge mandate. I think there's gonna be a lot of pressure on people, key figures like um, Jason Smith and Crapo to just like kind of reset and then reset the terms and just work together. Just because, like for example, President Trump will be looking for something to be done on the tax cuts, sometime next year. And again, it comes to like the when it comes to the sequencing of this, I think there's going to be some interesting things to see how this shakes out, because there's already chatter about government funding cutting into going into the spring, and that's probably going to set momentum for tax reform being done in the first 100 days. So, Congress really works with deadlines, government funding. If that's the first one, that's really, they can really do walk, and they can only do so much walking and chewing gum at the same time. So with the tax deadline in particular, with the December, I think there's a lot to be seen there.
Yeah, that's useful information, especially because every administration comes to town saying we're going to hit the ground running, and then as soon as you actually have to do these confirmation battles and the CR and some of these other things, it starts to chew up clock really quick. So it may be the best laid plans start to face reality sooner than we mentioned Jason Smith. Obviously, Republicans are facing looks. It's probably going to be an extremely tight House margin. What do you see as some of the key dynamics driving the House? It's always going to be a little more responsive than the Senate in terms of where the party is shifting away from. You look at the people who were there in 2017: Kevin Brady, Paul Ryan, some of these, Pat Toomey on the other side, who were very sort of classical limited government, tax reform, clearing out some of these breaks and provisions, that sort of thing. Where do you? But it's a new day now, right? Especially in the House. Where is some of that momentum shift heading towards? And again, if there's some key players to watch in terms of leadership or key committees when it comes to tax policy, who are some of those people who you might be keeping an eye on?
I think the House is going to be a very interesting body to observe during this whole tax fight. I've covered the House Republican majority for so much of this year. I feel like we're entering in this era of like pinhole majorities in which they're even like you said, like the best laid ambitions can only go so far. But in my conversation with the House Republicans, you hear a lot more concerns about the national debt. You'll hear a lot more of them talk about the different fiscal environment that we're operating in compared to 2017. And, I've heard that, some Republicans in the past have gotten sticker shock, when they learn about the full scope of what extending TCJA means. We're talking about a $5 trillion range when all is said and done. And if you do like a clean extension. So, I think there's gonna be an interesting split there between House and Senate Republicans because Smith has talked a lot more about, doing this in a fiscally responsible way, while you've seen Senator, incoming Senate Finance Chairman Mike Crapo, and he's told me this in the past too, that he doesn't think a tax policy needs to be offset. So I think there's going to be an interesting tension there between the two chambers on how to approach this. And some other key figures, obviously, in the House too. Speaker Mike Johnson, compared to Paul Ryan, he hasn't served on Ways and Means. Reforming the tax code hasn't been his life's project as it was with Paul Ryan. And this is going to be like a very big high stakes fiscal fight in which he has to deal with the same unwieldy majority that he had to deal with this year. And, I think you and I have talked about this as well. This time, Republicans are in full control of Congress and the White House. Like it was with Democrats and Build Back Better. If they fail, they'll only have themselves to blame. And I think that the party itself will be its own worst enemy as it sorts out what it wants to prioritize in this tax fight.
No, I think that's a really provocative analogy to think about. Part of the reason my analysis of why Build Back Better kind of came apart at the seams and they kind of had to repackage some of it as the Inflation Reduction Act was inability to prioritize, right? You had everything, everybody had their preferred approach and program, and you try to stuff it all in this massive reconciliation thing that falls apart because Joe Manchin gets cold feet and presumably others too. We don't actually know, if there would have been others as well. But part of that was because they were not able to pick, a handful of things and discreetly say, this is what we're going to fund. It's not going to be a temporary thing. We're going to actually do this. So that's a lesson, right? For Republicans to say, during the campaign, there was all sorts of things being tossed around. No tax on tips, free IBM, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime, tax deductible generators for people hit by hurricanes. All this kind of stuff gets thrown around. But then, to your point, the rubber hits the road. Have you heard of any of these, pejoratively gimmick or, maybe less pejoratively smart politics types, more carve out type stuff that might be catching fire among a Republican majority that's looking for ways to kind of build a more populist brand?
I think one of the earlier, or one of the more Trump threw this out on the campaign trail, but one that I think has some juice is the no tax on tips. Trump rolled it out, and a lot of Republicans rushed to back him up with bills of their own. If I recall, Ted Cruz has one that actually gained the support of Democrats like even Rosen and CCM. So that itself, no tax on tips, is already bipartisan, and Harris herself endorsed it on the trail, if I remember right. So I think that's going to be one part of this tax policy that would depending on how you structure it could benefit lots of people in the working class voters, the people that Republicans are trying to make further inroads in, and then depending on if they can get this in a reconciliation bill or not, there might already be some negotiating ground with Democrats. And actually, one more thing on the lessons, because I was just thinking about this earlier too. I think Republicans also run the risk of not learning the lessons that, not learning from Democrats' own mistakes, because we just saw earlier that Steve Scalise in a closed door meeting, this is reported in Punchbowl, he was laying out some, big overarching priorities for Republicans in a reconciliation bill. Taxes made the cut, energy made the cut, immigration / the border made the cut. So, Republicans seem to be wanting to do the same thing about stuffing a lot of different priorities in here. And when you're governing with these very narrow pinhole majorities, anybody could play the role of Manchin in the House if they want to, and in the Senate as well. For example, Rand Paul might be the one who tries to, muster up a lot of concerns around the deficit. He's been very consistent on this. So I think that there's gonna be a lot of dynamics to keep an eye on going into next year as we go into a Republican controlled Congress under President Trump again.
Right. Well, and that's where I want to end the conversation with you. Is you're a Congress guy. Former staffer. My heart is always letting Congress take the lead on these sort of things, as the Constitution suggests. But we all know that the president has a huge bully pulpit, and he doesn't sit down there on the floor negotiating this text. But if he got behind something, one way or the other, it could have a huge impact on how these things to get negotiated. Do you sense that the Trump administration is taking any different approach to Capitol Hill from the, maybe mistakes, arguably they made it the first time around? Obviously, they handed the reins over to Speaker Ryan, and he said we want to do healthcare first. We all know how that ended, and so they kind of had to do taxes as a second. Do you think the White House is going to again, take a different tack? We think President Trump is going to get involved in some of the stuff, or obviously too soon to tell exactly who the personnel is going to be. But what kind of role do you think him or Vice President Vance might play in helping shape some of these things, and where they're going to put their finger on the negotiations?
Very good question. And I think it's a little early to tell, only because, like, for example, former President Trump hasn't made key appointments. We're still waiting to see the outcome of his Treasury Secretary pick. And, I think that, when it comes to Trump, he's never been known for getting into the nitty gritty of policy. I don't think we can expect that to change in the second term. I think a lot of us would be surprised if it did. And he's hewed a little bit to at least like picking a VP who has like some congressional connections. Like Mike Pence was a well-known brand among House Republicans, JD Vance, a well-known brand among Senate Republicans. So there's like some things that he's already like keeping very similar. When it comes to taxes, I'm still a little fuzzy on what will ultimately come of Trump's involvement. He's very known to just like throw things out, and then his staff just has to kind of make it work under the parameters that he lays out. Sometimes they talk him out of things. So I think it's fair to say that a lot of us are going to be scrolling through X for whatever Elon Musk has to say too, Truth Social for Trump's own truth posts to see like how things shake out next year on taxes.
Yeah, it will be a wild ride as always, and wherever your next institutional home is, Joseph, we'll all be benefiting from your shoe leather reporting as always. So thank you so much for joining us for the first part of this conversation. We'll let you go back and see what Trump has tweeted in the last 20 minutes, and bring in our panel of folks along different perspectives on the right. And so as we switch that out, I'll start introducing them just briefly for the benefit of our audience. We've got John Shelton with American Advancing Freedom, Advancing American Freedom, the think tank founded by former Vice President Mike Pence. He's been involved in tax and pro-life, pro-family negotiations, and a former Capitol Hill staffer. Leah Libresco Sargeant of the Niskanen Center, author of a couple different books and engaged in, again, trying to build a more pro-family America. She writes the Substack Other Feminisms. And Autumn Christensen, Vice President for Public Policy at the Susan B. Anthony List. She is also a longtime Hill staffer, joined the SBA team in 2017, and we're so grateful to have them all on. I think there's a way to bring them all up here, maybe. I'm not the Zoom guy, so there we go. Now we can see everybody. All right. So why don't we start with John? I'm going to pick on him as the representative of, I think it's fair to say, the more traditional wing of conservatism, the one that stands for low taxes, limited government, staunchly pro-life. Again, the think tank founded by former President Pence and that school of thought. And as you hear what Joseph was just talking about, and the strains on the right as it comes to tax policy and pro-family more broadly, what are some of the priorities that your organization is bringing to the table? What are some of the challenges and opportunities that kind of presents as we head into next year?
Yeah, so I think it's a pretty fair description of where we're at in the broader conservative movement. AEF's done a lot of work with Kevin Brady, Senator Toomey, who are both the respective committee chairs responsible for tax cuts in 2017. So before earlier this week, I was looking through the different campaign websites for all the new members who came in. We've already talked some about people who have left. So Brady, Toomey, Ryan are no longer around. We no longer have this kind of, people putting out this, mastermind budget/tax blueprint, better way style that answers kind of a comprehensive tax reform thing. So 2017 kind of was more that, or started as that. And that's not what we're going to see in 2025. It's already a big difference too. So when you look at the people who came in, a lot of them didn't actually run at all on taxes. There was a couple people who, if you go on their campaign websites, they talked about protecting President Trump's expiring tax cuts. But through all the different new members I saw, it's like, I think 30 or so new people coming in on the Republican side. Only one of them specifically mentions child tax credit. They might all mean that or be interested in that. But generally, if you saw that, it was either holding the line and reauthorizing the expiring portions of 2017 tax reform, or just kind of further, in general, tax cuts. And so it's a very normie, kind of incoming class of people. And as Patrick said, and you guys were talking about earlier, it's unclear what the dynamic will be because while you're losing people like J.D. Vance from the Senate and Marco Rubio from the Senate, and Rubio's going off to state where he'll presumably not be a part of these negotiations. You also have Vance kind of as replacing what was done before by really just Ivanka Trump in the White House. And so to that extent, you have more negotiating power there to do something. And then you also have very different kind of Office of Legislative Affairs. So the Braids, there's a lot of them in Washington, D.C. James Braid was J.D. Vance's legislative director. And so he's taken over that role. During 2017, it was our chairman, Mark Short, who had very kind of strong business community connections. And so it's unclear if, does the kind of populist family forward element of the tax debate have a leg up this time around, and it will be less kind of Rubio and Lee holding the floor like last time? Or is it going to be kind of put on the back burner to other priorities? Because so far we've talked about lots of the individual provisions, and some of those are gimmicks, and we'll see. But from last time, Trump took his campaign promises very seriously. There's a literal whiteboard in the White House. My friends who served reminded me, and they would kind of look at it and see what they said and had they done it yet. So as bizarre as some of these are, I think there's going to be a big effort, and committees are taking these seriously, marking them up. But then we haven't even talked about the corporate side of this, because while the corporate changes in 2017 were largely permanent, Trump, more than talking about kind of individual side changes besides these new things, really was talking about 15% corporate rate for domestic manufacturers. And so like how these things all play together is going to be really interesting to see. And because it was a big part of just earlier this year, the Biden-Smith negotiations had to kind of very carefully try to balance the pro-business taxes with the pro-individual side taxes. And ultimately that fell apart. Now we've got a trifecta. And so theoretically that should kind of come together, consolidate better. But my concern is that rather than being this opportunity to kind of do something cool and interesting and Republican, it's going to be, there's just so many different targets. It's not just the corporate stuff. It's not just no tax on tips. It's also, implementing tariffs as pay-fors is this kind of idea that keeps coming up. And it's going to be really, really hard to build this plane. So that's kind of my initial thoughts.
Yeah, the analogy I used to someone earlier was they're not just building a plane while they're flying, but they're also figuring out the flight plan at the same time, because I don't think anybody quite knows, but there's definitely a hunger for something. And so that's where I want to turn to Leah Sargeant, again from the Niskanen Center. Leah's thought a lot about what a working class pro family policy agenda might look like. As you survey the landscape and again, the various provisions that are being thrown out there, where are some of the maybe low-hanging fruit opportunities for a Republican trifecta that was interested in delivering on its more working class friendly messaging could turn to? And do you think that there's actual momentum behind any of those?
I think the good news, in some sense, is that there has to be momentum. Everyone knows that if nothing happens, parents are facing a cut from $2,000 a kid to $1,000 a kid. And I think in both parties, that's seen as unacceptable. So we know there needs to be new CTC reform in the next tax package. And the question is what form it will take. And I think there's a lot of common sense support for basically these three principles. The CTC needs to keep pace with the cost of a child. When families are making the right choices, we need to do right by them. When you're getting married, taking on more work, you shouldn't see a penalty in your CTC. And that, especially in this time with a lot of pressure on our deficit, when we spend money, we want it to have a big impact for the money spent. And I think that leads a number of good policy options on the table. The most basic is we need to raise the CTC. Every year, even aside from when we're facing this potential cut next year with the expiration of TCJA, every year parents face a cut. So I get $2,000 for each of my kids, but if it kept pace with inflation, I'd get $2,500. I've seen my CTC whittled away year by year. So I'm hoping to see that CTC raised to at least $3,000, maybe a little more for younger kids. I want to see a CTC that's fair to working families. We want parents who are doing the right thing, entering the workforce, taking on work, not reaching the wages they hope to reach in the long term, hopefully receive the full value of their CTC. You can do that a couple ways. You can phase it in per child so that a parent with 2 kids doesn't have to earn twice as much to earn the full value that each of their kids should receive. You can look at capping the amount that any parent has to earn in order to reach that target. So Mitt Romney's Family Security Act takes that approach. Instead of having a phase-in rate, it has kind of a phase-in ceiling. Once you're reaching a certain amount of money, you've reached your full CTC. It just scales in linearly as you go. And it's really long past time we get rid of one of the last major marriage penalties in this area of family benefits, which is the head of household filing status, which not only penalizes parents for getting married, it's also one of the more regressive parts of our tax structure. So when you file for head of household as a single parent, you have a lot more money available to you for claiming that filing status if you're high income than if you're low income and you've only got a little bit of taxes owed on the table in the first place. The money we save by rolling back that marriage disincentivizing, rich people rewarding part of our family benefits can be used to defray the parts of the CTC that reach working families who need it most. And finally, I think when we're looking at not only where can we strengthen the policies we already have, but Maybe if we can get away with it, add a little more. What I'd love to see is Congress commit to a baby bonus, maybe around $2,000 per kid in that first year, right when they're born, not waiting for the next year's tax filing. That's a policy that's limited in cost. It's only for a child's first year. You're looking at a much more limited scope of payments. It's not welfare dependency inducing. You're just getting it that first year. It's not disincentivizing work in the long term or leading you to change your long-term plans to keep getting that money. And it meets parents at that moment when they know they need the money most, when they're making that transition. When we know the poorest parents feel the most vulnerable and pressured not to say yes to that child, that's the number one reason for abortion, is financial concerns. And I think, the good news about all these policies is they're well tested and we understand kind of all the inputs and outputs. If we're looking at a tax package that passes through reconciliation, something that starts moving fast, keeps going faster, you don't want your family benefits program to be plagued by some of the same problems we saw with the Biden Build Back Better childcare subsidies, where you had this over-engineered problem that the longer they kicked the tires, the more problems emerged. The CTC is one of the best family benefits programs we have. Shifting family benefits, consolidating them in what works, means that we can get going quickly in fitting this into an overall tax package. We know how it's going to work. We know that it's going to work. We know that it's been working for families for years.
Well, thanks, Leah. And that sets up perfectly a chance to bring in Autumn Christensen. And but as I do that, I'll just say, if anybody has any questions, hopefully we have plenty of time for that. Feel free to enter them in the chat, and I'll make sure to pass those along and hopefully lead to a lively and productive discussion. But feel free to add those now, or as Autumn speaks. But Autumn, thanks for being here. And I think Leah sets us up perfectly to talk about some of these fiscal policies that directly relate to the decision to choose life or not. Obviously, the pro-life movement has had kind of its ups and downs over the last couple of years since Dobbs, but I think there's a growing sense that the next phase of the pro-life movement, whatever that looks like, is going to include more of this engagement with questions of tax policy and fiscal policy and ways to support moms and families and babies in meaningful ways. What are some of the areas that you and SBA List are looking at and putting on the table as you're engaging with this incoming Republican trifecta?
Well, thank you, Patrick. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you guys today. And I think you're right that this is an important time to be talking about supporting moms and families. And of course, we are in a Congress that with narrow majorities, but an administration that has great opportunity to do really important things for moms who might consider abortion. J.D. Vance has had a strong interest in supporting struggling women and families. And in a time when we are trying to be fiscally responsible as a nation, it's also a time to really prioritize those resources and the ones that are needed to support a mom who might otherwise consider an abortion. How can those be best leveraged to support her? I think that often we know, but the American public may not always realize that when we're talking about women who have abortions, we're talking about 75% of women who have abortions are living at 200% of poverty or lower. At 50% of poverty, or 50% of them are at 100% of poverty or lower. So they are really struggling. And they're also struggling from the 50 years of legal abortion that has created this inordinate social pressure on pregnant women to have an abortion, especially women in poverty. She's often driven toward a life-altering decision because of circumstances, not choice or preference. And it's certainly not because she views it as an empowering choice. In fact, and often before I go any further, I should say that this liberal abortion policy of abortion on demand through all 9 months of pregnancy that we've seen over the last 50 years also lets men off of the hook and leaves that decision squarely in the hands of the mom. We know that women say, even Lawrence Feiner wrote, and he's certainly not a pro-life researcher, wrote that many of the women that he surveyed were disappointed. They were women obtaining abortions. They were disappointed because their partner had reacted to the pregnancy by denying paternity, breaking off communication, saying they didn't want a child. And then our researcher at the Charlotte Lozier Institute, David Reardon, often refers to what he calls the epidemic of unwanted abortion. And so that epidemic of unwanted abortion really ties into the 2/3 of women who've had abortions who found the abortion to be inconsistent with their values and their preference, and say that they would have preferred to give birth. 60% say if they had just had the emotional and financial support that she needed. So these statistics show that abortion is all about insurmountable factors. And that you may think, well, what's the answer to that in a fiscally conservative environment? And I would say, first of all, we know that for decades, charities have helped women by coming alongside of them to meet their emotional and material needs. And the Trump administration has a tremendous opportunity to maximize the impact of programs. So while the Biden administration put out an executive order calling on his entire administration to promote abortion through this reproductive rights task force, and popped up a website to point women towards abortion, and Gavin Newsom was, as you said, in this post-Dobbs world, running around the country, putting up billboards, telling women to come to California for a free abortion. We have an opportunity to do something much more hopeful and much more impactful under the Trump administration. And that's to just turn that reproductive rights task force on its head. It's an existing expenditure. Turn it around and make it into a program that helps women to maximize the resources that are available by listing out those programs that are available to them so they can easily find them on a website. And then tasking every agency with finding the programs that can help moms, and then making sure that they are going to really have a difference in their lives and help them go from dependency to independence. I will say that we have, through our relationships with many pregnancy centers and other assistance providers across the country, have found that the areas where women have greatest need tend to be housing, transportation, childcare, and addiction recovery. And all of those are areas where faith-based organizations and community organizations have some of the greatest potential to meet not only the material need, but the emotional and community needs that are there. And we spend billions of dollars in that space. So as we're looking at the dynamics that have been described here around tax policy and reconciliation and budget, we have an opportunity to look at each of those programs and have secretaries of each of those agencies prioritize the program flexibility and the program notice opportunities to really prioritize faith-based community organizations that can focus their efforts on the pregnant and parenting mom and help her move from dependency towards independence. And we have a whole bunch of ideas in that space coming out soon in a series of papers. I'm going to stop talking, but we have a series of papers coming out between now and the inauguration to provide a guide to some of the places where the administration could look to maximize funds and for the benefit of women. And I do just want to just close out my initial comments here with a story from a woman who resisted the pressure to abort. And she said, for years, abuse and assault meant immersing myself in drugs and alcohol. My positive pregnancy test was the one thing that jolted me back to reality as I stared in terror at the 2 pink lines in that little window. And so the question is, who can be there for her when she stares at those 2 pink lines and she doesn't have a supportive partner alongside of her? Or maybe she does, but the financial concerns or the community support concerns are great. She said that's when she met 2 people that founded a maternity home who welcomed her with open arms. And the next years of learning, the next few years, she was learning how to take care of herself and her growing baby were some of the hardest in her life, but they transformed her life and her future future in an incredible way. So we want to lift up those types of programs and look forward to a administration that can do that work. And maybe some of that work can be done in Congress as well.
Well, thank you, Autumn, and that's a wonderful story to share. That's obviously the work of so many crisis pregnancy centers and others who do that work every day that their stories don't get told enough. I want to use that as an opportunity to kind of springboard to this conversation and bring in some of the questions that I've been getting by picking up on this theme of helping them come out of dependence and towards self-sufficiency. This has obviously been a huge red line in Republican negotiations around the child tax credit, around this idea of refundability. And I'm gonna throw this at John because I'm gonna pick on him for a second. There's been a number of think tanks, including AAF, who, when the Wyden-Smith bill came out, jumped on this question of, if you go past the point of tax refundability, this is not enabling self-sufficiency. This is actually enabling, a form of welfare spending, right? Do you sense that there's a need for a new, again, pointing to John here, but I'm going to open it up as well. Like, as the politics of this issue continue to evolve, right? And I think we've seen the abortion-related ballot amendments and just, how President Trump has talked about it on the campaign trail. The women who are most in need, especially in this class out there, and working class families more generally, those are not the ones with a lot of federal tax liability to knock out, right? So is there a need or an openness, or, do you see the side of those who would say, well, this is, Republicans need to kind of get past this, or is this a time to think about some of these other creative Autumn's talking about, right? Funding CCDPG and prioritizing pregnant moms, or maternity homes and that sort of thing. How are you trying to balance those sort of things as you're thinking through these different issues?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to say is that I think you said, so according to Chairman Smith's estimates, if the 2017 tax cuts expire, that's a $1,500 tax burden on every single household. So already we're setting up this problem that, if what Autumn says is right about the kind of financial impacts and the way it drives abortion, that's really not good. And so then you have to figure out, okay, so how are we going to kind of lock in place these policies that we agreed on in 2017? Well, now you suddenly have a $4 to $5 trillion bill to foot, according to CBO. Now they're wrong all the time, but we have to take them seriously because it's part of the explicit statutory procedural process. But so now we have to figure out, how are we going to pay for even just keeping things at the status quo that everyone's expecting to keep even? And the politics are insane on that because Democrats are either going to stick it to Republicans for saying, well, you're driving up the debt another 4 or 5 trillion, or it fails, reauthorization fails to go through, and oh wow, you imposed $4 to $5 trillion of new taxes on people. So it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. And then so on top of that, and I think it's right to be talking about how are we going to reform past TCJA, because I think the only way to kind of address that is to have a tax package that is exciting, that is new, that's not merely reiterating the status quo. Because if you're spending that much money, you're going to have people convinced that this is doing good for them. And this is why I brought up all the kind of politically extenuating circumstances in the beginning. Is I think they all matter. It's not just there's a value in how much money we kind of are recognizing. Children in the tax code is actually, I think, a really interesting, worthwhile to some extent cause of over saying this is a valuable thing. But if the goal is an economic goal, then these proposals to pay for these tax cuts, to pay for potentially, if we're going to take the child tax credit to $4,000 a year, like Vance has proposed, if we pay for that with tariffs, those tariffs are going to be paid for by those single mothers with multiple children. And so you have to actually run the kind of cost benefits. Is it worth it to do this or not if we're going to have to pay for it? And I think largely, the agreement, Patrick, correct me if I'm wrong, last time was something like we allowed like $1.7 trillion of deficit impact, and the rest had to be offset in some kind of way. And so we're going to have to figure that out. And so the disagreement here isn't so much about, do we want a tax code that works for families and for parents? It's how do we deliver that? And so it's kind of it's a question of how big of a scope should you have. So, and I wonder if Congress is going to be able to even lock in the wins we got in 2017. And what's the cost of that going to be? Is it going to be, 40% tariffs on goods from China, 20% across the board? If so, like when we run the math, does that hold even or not? What does or does not? So we're interested in more of these kind of macro questions, and probably that's where our focus will be. I think there's a lot of merits to like the way that you guys are talking about the CTC is really smart, focusing on like the criteria Leah said about most bang for your buck. You could even figure out ways to accomplish what Vance has said, like doing a $4,000 just in the first year is 1/18 of the cost of doing it every year.
Right.
And so there's ways to kind of achieve these goals. And if it's just sort of, we want to put like, to every parent in the country to say like, we recognize you. If that's the goal, then there's ways to do that that are a lot more cost effective. Anyway, so I'll stop there. But I think the how the sausage is made is going to kind of determine everything this year.
Leah, do you have thoughts on how the sausage gets made?
Yeah, I think there's nervousness around refundability that's really about worry about a poverty trap. And I think what's important to remember when we're thinking about what are we doing now for family benefits? How do they differ from the history of both how we've structured welfare, how we've reformed welfare, is that what matters for whether we're helping families get a hand up is whether we're penalizing work or penalizing marriage. And a CTC that's phasing in, something that's phasing in faster, phasing in per child, is rewarding you for work every step of the way. The question is just, what scope of your income are we rewarding work for? Are we saying we're rewarding that first $20,000 and then you've hit it, you've earned back your full CTC? Is it important that we reward up to $60,000? The CTC is actually pretty well structured in that we don't have the kind of punitive phase outs, cliffs that you see with other programs. So if we're looking for a way to give money to the children who need it, you're doing pretty well. You're avoiding those traps that I think people still have very sensitive spots around, because at every step, working more either helps you or is neutral.
Autumn, I'll let you weigh in there if you want, but I also want to bring in something that Leah mentioned in the first round, which is this idea of, so-called baby bonus, or this idea that when you have a baby and you file for that baby's social security number, you basically get that back with a check, right? A couple of weeks after birth to kind of help smooth over some of those bumps along the way. How do you think about that as a way of being a really salient and signature way of supporting life versus something like an unborn child tax credit, allowing people to claim the child tax credit for the year that mom is pregnant, versus, other ways that we could imagine, Senator Rubio's bill, funding community and faith-based organizations that do the kind of work we were talking about. How do you think about those in different ways of and what's the role of the federal government in trying to materially support pregnant moms?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you think about pregnancy, anyone who has had a child, their wife or their partner or themselves has had a child, that it's not like, a free pass until the day the baby's born and then, oh, now the costs kick in. There is, especially if you're low income, there's a lot of costs that sit around. If you are a sole provider and you're low income and you can't work due to your pregnancy, you can find yourself in a very difficult situation during pregnancy. A lot of the costs around healthcare and around preparing for the child, getting on waiting lists for childcare, all of those kinds of things. Many of those costs come clearly during the period when the baby is in utero. So anytime we can acknowledge the unborn child as the child that is already a part of the family in all of the ways that we love and care for them, but also in all of the ways that our kids drain our bank accounts. The more that we can keep that front and center in these conversations, the better. There's been a lot of creative ideas about how to best meet that need that a mom and a dad have during the pregnancy period. But I would just caution and remind that those costs don't just arrive and appear on the baby's arrival at the hospital. They are there long before, and particularly for those vulnerable women that I described, they are living literally paycheck to paycheck, and a missed paycheck could really send their whole life. They could be the trigger that sends them into homelessness or into real catastrophic situations. And so that's why it's important to be looking at housing. It's important to be looking at transportation. It's important to be funding the organizations across government agencies that do the work that help women in those circumstances, alongside of our discussion about the child tax credit.
I just want to tag on with Autumn there for a moment. I think that's what's really promising about a baby bonus, and especially some of the policies to see it come earlier. I'm someone who, on my most recent delivery, couldn't work for 2 weeks because of medical complication before my baby was born. And I had the cushion of paid family leave so that I knew I could do right by my baby and right by my family as a wage earner. A lot of women don't have that cushion. And one of the best things about a baby bonus that comes, either right with the baby or starts coming partway through the pregnancy is it operates as kind of a, lowest possible safeguard of what we want out of paid family leave without lots of the complications of a full program. It gives you some amount of money that's there for the time you might need to take off before or after. And every parent gets to decide how best to spend it, whether it's to cushion leave, unexpected medical leave, or simply the many purchases a baby requires.
John, you want to weigh in or anything related, or we'll move to our exit question, which is knowing everything that we know now and hearing what Joseph mentioned at the beginning of the hour here. Where would you encourage Congress to spend their energies? Again, I'm thinking of the suite of campaign promises that were made over the course of the 2024 election. But if there was one thing, as they're building the plane and putting the puzzle piece together, one program or provision that you would recommend, head and shoulders above the rest, this is the the number one thing they should do. You're welcome to repeat your baby bonus answer, Leah, if you want, or something else. Maybe we'll start with Autumn and just your number one recommendation for Congress as they head into this cycle.
Yeah, I think it's in tandem with the Trump administration to create that support for pregnant and parenting moms task force, and that has to be right off the bat throughout government and with the support of the Congress to unravel some of the bad things, but more importantly, to quickly make those resources that are currently available, but hidden in the bowels of the bureaucracy, to make pregnant women aware of them and able to access them.
Leah, your top.
I think we know we have to see the CTC overhauled, but with a Republican trifecta, if you're going to pick one new policy that has your stamp, your signature that this government brought into effect, I think it's got to be the baby bonus. Everyone knows what it is, something Trump and Vance have both talked about on the trail. And that's the benefit of the trifecta, that what you pass is something you can make a signature for a party that's trying to embrace a working class alignment.
And John, your number one priority that Congress should keep in mind as they're going through next year.
Yeah, I think it's really just costs in general. And so this will be lean into my kind of old school lameness, is if the crisis of declining birth rates and lack of marriageability among men and all this is happening, the CTC is actually too late to address a lot of these problems. You need to have wages going up. So like the interventions I would focus on are housing, cost of goods. Corporate rate is honestly like one of the better dials for this. And so as lame as it sounds in a kind of family policy setting to talk about corporate rates, like if you want to address wages for men, like and kind of so that they feel ready to get married and to have kids, because usually it's on the front end. Well, we're not in an economic position to have this yet. They're not kind of doing their tax returns and figuring it out. It's what are my wages now? What's my take-home income now? So before these children ever come, that's kind of what we need to think about. And so ideally, I think we'd be kind of bifocal. We'd be not just looking at explicit family kind of child policies, but the broader environment that makes people feel like they're ready to go, so that all of us on this call who probably have young families and children have a cohort, because I think it's the biggest thing in the end is creating a culture requires not just making parenthood seem feasible or making it better once you're already there, but getting people to get there sooner. So yeah.
Well, if Congress adopts any of those, I expect you three to take full credit, and look forward to engaging with you as we figure out what's next and what the 2025 tax year will bring us. So we'll have this recording up on our website in case anybody joined late. You're welcome to go back and catch anything that you missed on the front end. But until we meet again, thank you all for being here, and we'll see what happens coming up down the pike here. Thanks.